boldness and confidence. The truth of your word would pierce our hearts, and would speak to us both individually and corporately together as a class. So thank you for this time. We ask for your presence to be here, to be with us, and to speak to us at this time. We thank you. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. And welcome again.
Morning.
Good morning.
9 years ago, about this time 9 years ago, I was in New York for a business trip. My first ever business trip, my first ever trip to New York, my first ever trip to the US to begin with. And it was a trip where, if business trips, if you understand business trips, companies pay for you when you go on a business trip. So they pay for all my meals, they pay for my accommodation, and I thought, why not? I'm going to try the most fancy uptown steakhouse in New York City, and I'm going to get the company to pay for it. So after work, I was all dressed up like that because I've just finished my work, and I was making my way to the restaurant. I found a table, sat by myself. It was pretty dark, kind of like a fancy restaurant thing. And then I ordered a New York strip, medium rare, I remember, and then I had a small glass of wine. And I enjoyed the steak. It was really calming. It was really nice. And at one point, I needed to go to the restroom, so I stood up, and I made my way straight to the restroom. And as I was walking, a man stuck out his hand, and he stopped me, and he said, "Excuse me." I said, "Yes." He said, "Can I have some cold water in my glass, please?" I was like, "No, you got it wrong. I don't work here." And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And so I continued walking, and then I got stopped again by another person who said, "Check, please." And then I realized that when you go to a fancy steakhouse or a fancy restaurant and you're dressed up like that, people can mistake you for being a server. I mean, it's not like I had a towel on my hand and I was walking around and I said, "Who wants a cold glass of water?" I was just dressed the way I was. And I realized that sometimes the lines between the ones who serve and the ones who are served can be so blurred in those settings. And we read about the same thing in the Bible. In the book of Luke, if you turn with me in the book of Luke, chapter 22, Jesus talks about the same thing. He talks about people who serve and people who are being served. And he tells us something which we call today as servant leadership. So let's take a look at it. Chapter 22 of Luke, verse 24 to 30. A dispute also arose among them as to which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest. But he said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you just as my Father has conferred on me, a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So here's the setting that Luke is bringing this story into. It is the Passover. It's Jesus' final meal with his disciples. It's what we call the farewell discourse in Luke. So farewell discourse means that somebody's going to say his last words. He knows he's going to die. He's saying his most important things to the most important people in his life. So Jesus sat down at the table, gave the cup, broke the bread, and he says, "This is the blood of my new covenant shared for you. And someone among you on this table is going to betray me." And then they start discussing among themselves. Who is it? Is it that person? Is it that person? At which point, the conversation suddenly changed into this. "Jesus, that's really cool. That's really cool. But really, who is the greatest among us? Is it Peter? Is it John?" How can the disciples, at this point of time in Jesus' life, where he's making the most important speech, important teachings of his life, think about themselves and try to decide who is the greatest? And I would say the disciples didn't get what Jesus was all about. And Jesus had to reteach them what it means to be a leader in the kingdom of God. What it is to embody servant leadership just as Jesus had done throughout his whole life. Many of us here, sometimes we love the idea of servant leadership more than servant leadership itself. We think it is a noble thing to do. It is even a right thing to do. But it's so hard to put into practice. Servant leadership, two very different ideas put together. It's almost like an oxymoron. right? Almost like it doesn't make sense. But in Luke 22, we see that Jesus made sense of it. We see that Jesus put these two things together in perfect harmony, showing us that that is what the kingdom of God is all about. So today I want to talk about servant leadership. And I want to talk about two aspects of servant leadership. What is the nature of leadership, according to Luke 22? And what is the nature of serving, according to Luke 22? So if you look at verse 25, Jesus says this: the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. And this makes perfect sense in Jesus' time, during the Greco-Roman world, where those who had money, those who had status, are those people who have power. And these are people who have the right and the ability to give out money, give out honor, give out status to anybody whom they want to. So for example, if the city was in need of money to build roads, who do they turn to? The people who have money, the people who have status, the people who have power. If they want to restore the amphitheater, who do they look to? These people. If they want to build new schools, if they want to feed the hungry and the poor, who do they turn to? These people. These people have the ability to make things happen in the city. So it is in their interest to keep the power for themselves. It is in their interest to keep the city poor so that the city is always in need of them. It is in their interest to keep the people hungry so that the people always look to them as people who are great, somebody who can provide. And that's the world of leadership that Jesus lived in. And these are the same people who then, because the distribution of wealth and power is up to them, they distribute it in accordance with a way that would ascribe themselves the greatest honor. So for example, if I give money to somebody, I totally expect this person to repay me. Whether in money, in honor, in life, or with something that only money can buy, or even money can't buy, I expect something from them. And Jesus says, these are the kings of the Gentiles. These are the people who have authority over the people, but not so with you. Is this a problem only in the Greco-Roman world in Jesus' time? I don't think so. This is still a problem today. Just look within the churches, within the Christian circle in America and in the world. We have one great head, and that is Jesus Christ our Lord, who came to serve with his hands, calling us to serve and to lead just as he did. While we, many amongst us in the Christian world, who have been called to be the hands and the feet of Jesus, ironically elevate ourselves to be the head of his body. And this is the kind of world that we live in. But this is not the servant leadership that Jesus is talking about. Now notice that being a servant leader does not mean that we refuse authority. It's not like when your pastor says, okay, I'm going to make you a youth pastor. I'm going to make you a young adults pastor. I'm going to make you a leader in the church. You say, no. That's not biblical. That's not what Jesus is saying here. Now, if you look in verse 26, he says, the greatest among you must become like the youngest. The leader must become one who serves. He's not saying there can be no greatest among you. There can be no leader among you. He's saying, no, I'm assuming that there will be a greatest among you. I'm assuming that there will be a leader among you. In the later part of the story, he says, I'm going to make you rule, judging, which is to rule. I will make you rule the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm going to give you authority. It's assumed when the church begins, when I die, when I resurrect, when I ascend, you will take leadership over the church. So it is not unbiblical to be leaders. It is not unbiblical to receive authority. It's how we wield that authority that matters. Being a servant leader is a way of wielding authority while taking on the nature of being a server. And this is what Jesus says. Jesus, in verse 14, when he started the Passover, it says Jesus took his place at the table. What place was it? It was a place fit for the master. And then Jesus gave the cup and broke the bread. These are things that in the Passover, a head of a household, only the head of the household, will do for the family. Jesus didn't reject the authority. He didn't reject what he was supposed to do. He just did it. But he did it with his own hands, with a servant heart. And that's why he can say, I am among you as one who serves. Secondly, what is the nature of serving? Jesus describes servant leadership as a way of being. It is not a mental state. It is not an attitude even. It is those things, but it's not just that. Jesus says, I am among you as one who serves. And the word for serves is the verb diakoneo, which is where the word deacon comes from, which means to serve in many English translations, but literally it means waiting on tables. It means putting a cloth on your hand and going up to somebody and keeping your congregation on their toes and asking them, do you want a glass of cold water? What do you want today? How can I serve you today? Is it time for your check? Do you want a dessert menu? It's literally waiting on them. Somebody who serves at the table. Day in, day out, all the time. It is a way of being. It is a behavior. It is action. And that's how Jesus puts it. For example, some of us are going to get married really soon. And coming from somebody who's been married for a few good years, I really want my wife to be able to say that I'm a loving husband. Sometimes she says it, sometimes she doesn't. But here's the thing, right? So husband, I am a husband by virtue of my position, my status, my relationship with her. It's a given, right? Because we're married. Loving husband, that's whom I want to be. Is loving a mental state? Is loving an attitude? Do I love just by words? Do I love just by thinking about the fact that I love her as a loving husband? No. I act it out. It is a way of being for me. To make hot coffee in the cold morning for her before she wakes up. To make sure that she gets her paper done on time. To take the young boy, my son, our son, out to play at the playground so she can have her time. To make sure that she gets a Sabbath on Fridays. That's what I do as a loving husband, to show that I love her. And it's the same for a servant leadership. It is not to say that we must be humble only, that we must love God. We take the position of leadership. Yes, that's the reality. That's who we are in the church. And I do it with humility. I do it with love. I do it with an attitude that put people above myself. Yes. But is there more to it? Jesus says yes. You must be one who waits on tables. René Descartes, the famous philosopher in the 17th century, he said this: I think, therefore I am. Jesus in the book of Luke seems to be telling us something very different. He seems to be saying, you behave, therefore you are. You are your behavior. You are the sum of your actions. If you say yourself to be a servant leader, show it. What have you done? What are you doing? Yesterday I was really having a good time with my son, and we were playing on the floor. We had a really good morning. And in the afternoon, he wanted to play with his neighbors, which is what he usually does on a good day. And I will always tell him this. I said, Jude, so he's 2.5 years old. He's into his terrible twos and blah, blah, blah. And I said, Jude, if you want to play with your neighbors, you have to be a good boy. And then he says, I am a good boy. He says that all the time. Every time when I say, you got to be a good boy, I am a good boy. And I told him, Jude, in the morning, remember when Daddy was lying on the floor and you sat on his face and you started bouncing on his neck? That is not a good boy. Remember when Daddy told you, if you want to play with the camera, you have to be really careful. You have to not destroy it. And you dropped it on the floor. And it's the only place that has Mommy's and Daddy's honeymoon pictures in it. It is not a good idea. You were not a good boy. And at lunch, you were putting your finger into the bowl of soup and stirring it and washing your hands in the soup. That is not a good boy. If you want to be a good boy, Jude, you have to show me that you are a good boy. He was a good boy in the end, and then he got to play with his neighbors. But the idea is this. Are you showing yourself to be a servant leader? Are we acting out in a way that is in accordance with the servant leadership that Jesus is talking about? Are we servant leaders? And the next thing about serving is that you realize that